Wanted to share something that I had been experimenting around recently. I'm sure maybe you've seen these types of flexible arms, friction arm types. They're quite often used for cameras, and usually on one end you'll have a clamp that'll grab onto a table like this, and then you'll have another end with a quarter 20 thread on the end of it that you can thread your camera onto. And one of the things I'd gotten to thinking about, well, if I've got a clamp on one end, what happens if I were to take a clamp and thread it onto the other end? And for me, the results of this have been working quite well. And I hadn't seen anything out on posted anywhere about anyone trying anything similar, so I figured I would just share this idea and show some examples of its use. Of course, it's simple enough to put on there. You can just clamp one end onto the table, and then you can use the use the other end for holding other items. So, common use I've had for it is to use a flashlight. This is just one of the mini tactical type flashlights that you might see on eBay or Amazon, for example. So it's easy enough to untwist the arm and put the flashlight in there. And then, of course, you've got a convenient little flashlight holder. Now, another way it can be used, I've used it for electronic soldering. So another common use the way I've used it a couple of times is for holding connectors. So once you've got your connector in there, you can get it to whatever convenient angle that you need for soldering. And in fact, there's nothing stopping you from being able to use a second clamp to hold your cable close by, so you aren't sitting there trying to juggle a soldering iron and connectors and wires all at the same time while you're trying to get it soldered up. Now, for people that are in machining, they probably recognize this as something that's commonly referred to as a Noga arm. And an example of what I'll call a Noga style arm is here. Actually, this isn't a true Noga arm. This is it's a clone that looks like it. One of my earlier attempts at using this type of arm for holding stuff was actually to use a three-finger clamp like you would find in a chemistry lab, and I had actually used this particular method quite often for holding various items in different locations. Of course, the other big thing about this is, of course, this comes with a magnetic base, which that's fine if you've got a convenient flat magnetic surface, but it doesn't always work so well. Now, as far as the basic arm itself, I mean, you can find these on eBay if you do a search for like a camera friction arm or friction arm clamp. You can find these relatively easily on eBay or Amazon. Now, from what I've seen so far, they only come with one clamp, so you'll actually need to order an extra set of clamps. The ones I had got were like a pair for like $11. And in my case, of course, I've actually bought several of these clamps. Initially bought one for testing, and then two to continue using after I had sort of decided that the idea was going to work, and then I kept stealing those clamps from between projects, so I wound up buying 4 more of them. So right now I've got a set of 7 clamps. So what I'll do now, I've got some other examples set up here that I'm just going to show here. Of course, this is actually just the clamp by itself sitting here. Let me get this one moved out of the way. Now, if you have 80/20, one nice thing about having the quarter 20 thread in there is that is the type of thread that is used in 80/20. So, if say you're working on a circuit board, for example, and you've got it in the center section here, and maybe you need to hold some cables or some probes, then you can take this, slide it in there, eventually. The thread's just almost a little too short to work with this, but once you actually get it in there, actually you can find that 80-20 works quite conveniently. Again, you could use it for holding a flashlight on over your work, to be able to get better illumination. If you were maybe trying to take pictures of circuit board, I suppose you could even go a little more sophisticated and actually mount a camera on there and have some good support. So just another example I'll move over to here is again just working on a circuit board. If you've got a small enough circuit board, of course it's not that hard to to grip onto a circuit board. Of course, you do have to be a little careful because these clamps are made out of aluminum, so you'd want to make sure you're not overlapping any conducting areas. Another option might be, of course, one of the things I find sort of interesting. I mean, these clamps work well enough, but I think one of the more interesting possibilities would be to try and come up with different other types of clamps that could fit onto the end of this. So maybe one that's 3D printed out of plastic that's non-conducting, or something that has parallel gripping jaws instead of having that gap in the center. So we'll slide over to just another example here. This is just a little drone that I've got. I actually haven't had to work on this drone yet, but I could see a potential use, using two of these Noga arms or friction clamps to hold the hold the drone in a more convenient to work on position if I had to do maintenance on it. So again, it's just easy enough to move everything around, get things locked back down again, make it a little bit easier to work on things. One thing I will mention that I've had problems with on these arms, just to slide back over here and look down, is this is a threaded connection down here, and the problem that I've run into sometimes is that if you're pointed in the if your torque is on the wrong side, which I think in this case where this would be twisting in, if you had a lot of weight coming in on this side, then this might have a tendency to want to unscrew on you. What I've had to do to work around that is just put a bit of Loctite on the threads to make sure that that doesn't spin. Of course, the downside is, of course, if you do Loctite it in, then if you did come up with if you did have additional types of clamps that you would want to attach, then then of course it's going to be a little bit more awkward if you're using Loctite. Now, for additional types of things you could stick on the end, of course the Noga Noga style clamp has this big magnetic base, and of course this works fine for machining in if you've got a large enough surface. But another option that could be used is I've got these quarter 20 magnets, and actually this one turned out to be a little undersized, so I'd probably want to try and find one with a little bit larger base. But it's easy enough to spin that on. You can clamp that onto your surface, and as long as you're not applying too much torque on there, this actually holds up just fine. But again, it doesn't necessarily need a little. I need to get a little bit larger magnet to be able to really be able to use that, and of course, not too hard to get pulled off of there. What I'm going to do, I'm going to just go ahead and cover a couple of other examples of ways that I've used these clamps so far. Of course, try and keep the primary focus of what I'm working on in terms of projects, is my airplane. So actually, this is the wingtip on my wing, which at this point doesn't have a skin on it, so it sort of flops around, and I just like to be able to stabilize that. So It's easy enough to throw the clamp on here, have this come around, get a grip on here, not clamping too tight because you obviously don't want to bend the metal, but then I can get this positioned where I want it, tighten the arm down, and then it's not going anywhere. I'm going to cover a couple of other ways that I've used this as part of some of the larger projects related to my airplane. One of the problems I've run into is for example, I need to verify the spacing on my wing ribs here, and of course need to be able to hold this up, and there are different ways you could be able to handle that, but again, another place where the arms have come in handy is to be able to hold something steady like this. And one thing you'll notice, of course, the clamps grip just fine on a piece of 80-20, but then once I've got that on there, then I can go ahead and grip my ruler. I can lock that end down, and then grab my other clamp to get a hold of the other end. And that gives me a steady weight, gives me a nice secure way to be able to secure my ruler. And if I need to position it too, of course, nothing says you have to clamp these down completely tight. You could leave them just a little loose so that you're able to get some adjustability on these and get something exactly positioned where you want it at. Now, I guess one thing I can point out here that you would need to watch out for if you're using this. Using on the clamp, of course, these don't necessarily go. They're limited in how far they can bend over. So, if you've never used one of these before, they're limited in how far they can bend over. They can't go over 90 degrees on every single side. To be able to get all the way down to 90 degrees, you need to make sure that the stem is lined up with the slot, and then you can get it. So sometimes if you get into a situation where you're trying to get this clamped on, and of course it doesn't want to go in the direction you want to go, you just want to check it. You want to verify the location, make sure that the stem of this bolt is lined up with the slot. One of the other little projects that I've been messing around with is a surface grinder that I had purchased a while back and have been trying to get it up and running again, and it turned out there was a problem with one of the switches on the control panel here. And one of the ways that these little arms have come in handy is it's allowed me to free support this panel in midair. If I didn't have something like this, of course, this panel would be flopped down here, and it'd be dangling all over the place, and it'd just make it a lot more awkward and complex to try and replace that switch. So again, holding up things like control panels while you're trying to work on them is another way that these arms can be used. And one other small thing I'll point out here, if you've managed to stick with me this far, something else that I found to be rather useful are these little I think they're Arco Mill storage bins. And I've actually found these come in quite handy when I'm working on various projects, and I want to try and keep my tools from getting scattered all over the place. If I keep a couple of these bins like this nearby, I can sort of toss the tools into there, and I find myself spending a lot less time having to find tools as I'm working on something. So at this point, that's all I'll cover. I hope you found the video informative, and if you got any questions, feel free to ask.